Why should we listen to tough stories? That's what we're going to talk about today. Hi, this is Jill from the Northwoods, talking about topics to make your life better, one small step at a time. No big steps, nothing big and traumatic about it. I always started this podcast because sometimes people would talk in ways that I didn't think real people lived in. Well, I hired my personal chef, and then I had to my assistant do that. Some of us don't. We're just living life, all by ourselves and making the best we can. So small steps are what we do. And I hope this one helps you. I started thinking about this. This was kind of a funny origin for it. Is my grandmother grew up in Lithuania at a particular time, and then she moved around to various places. And strangely enough, I started telling ChatGPT about her life and all the things that she did. And what ChatGPT did was kind of interesting. It started filling out all the details of what was going on in those areas at that time. So at one particular point, she lived in Tel Aviv when it was part of the Ottoman Empire, and her father died. And her father died in the year that all the Jews were kicked out of Israel. And so she came to the United States, and she was about 8 years old. And so ChatGPT told me about all the various things that were going on in her life, and it made me a little sad because I wish I had asked her a little bit more about it. Back when I was a kid, I was sort of interested in my Irish and Scottish side, and wasn't as interested as in the Eastern European side of things. And now I know a little bit more about what was going on, and I wish I had asked her more questions. But she had a tough life, and imagine losing your father at 8 years old after you're already an immigrant to another country, and now you're being forced out of that country and forced into a country where you don't even speak the language, you don't know anything. And I started thinking a little bit about that, about why it's so important. And I think we're losing something in kind of the older generations because not all of us have those stories anymore. And a lot of us believe that we're living in uniquely hard times, that the pressure we're under is heavier, more complex, more exhausting than anything anyone has ever faced before us. And to be fair, of course, life is hard. Sometimes the world feels loud. It feels unstable. It feels that a lot of people are doing a lot of things that we don't approve of. And many people feel just tired in ways we just don't know quite how to name. But the question I guess I want to gently place on the table today is, what if our suffering feels unprecedented? Not because it is, but because it's the only suffering we know about. I mean, obviously, it's the only suffering we can feel because it's inside of us. But sometimes if we don't know about what has gone on in this world, other countries, other generations, then we don't realize that people who have been through horrible pains, overwhelming things, that their lives were threatened on a daily basis, and it can make us, I guess, in some ways feel like our own burdens are extremely heavy. And each person, of course, feels that their burdens are heavy because they're the ones carrying them. But we assume, that these are the worst times. We don't realize that there is like a whole other world going on out there, that we cut ourselves off from the wisdom of people who survived things that we never did have to face. And that will help us become better. It'll help us become stronger. It's not just about learning that we just don't have it so bad. That's not the message I'm trying to say. It is mostly like there are lessons to be learned out there in the world about hardship. And we can look beyond our own moment, and it doesn't cause us to lose, compassion for things that are going on right now. Instead, we gain more compassion. We discover what humans have been enduring through different generations and in different places of the world, and that they have faced uncertainty, danger, fear. And honestly, that's been going on since the beginning of mankind. But we're then find out too that we're not the first people to face hard times. We don't have to figure out how to survive these kinds of times or whatever it is you think is going on alone because there are people who have come through tough things, and it will help us to continue on. It will help us learn how to do better. Like I said, my grandfather escaped from Kiev when he was a 16-year-old boy. He escaped with his two younger sisters. One was 12, one was 14, and came to the United States without speaking any of the language. And he ended up putting himself through dentistry school, served in World War II, and protected them. And when I knew my grandparents, they were doing okay. But it wasn't about, like I said, these names and details. It was the texture of the lives, the pressure they faced, and the decisions they had to make as 16-year-olds, and my grandmother is an 8-year-old. And so it was really, the thing that struck me was they really had it hard. They really had it hard. They didn't know what was coming next. And so knowing about these hard lives, it gives us perspective, and it teaches us about human survival, not in some sort of movie montage, thing that, you think about these dramatic movies, but what do ordinary people do in extraordinary situations, and some of those as being incredibly painful situations. And so when we hear about people who lived harder lives than our own, there's a temptation to use that information, I think, in the wrong way. Well, we think, well, they had it worse, so I shouldn't complain. Or, well, life is brutal, we should just toughen up. Which, I tend to go in more the second thing is that I grew up, like I said, with mental health issues in my family, with alcoholism in my family. And I raised myself up reading books, one small step at a time, going to the library, learning how to do this and learning how to do that, and learning how people shouldn't press your buttons, and, reading Greek philosophy about Stoicism. And so in some ways, learning about these stories of my grandfather and my grandmother, the different kinds of struggles that they had, it didn't say to me, Jill, your problems don't matter. Just gut it up. They had it worse. Instead, it just showed me that I came from this line of resilience, that there are ways to get through very tough times. And it's not a competition of who has the most pain in the world. It's about knowing that other people have suffered more. And it doesn't erase our own suffering. And it doesn't, and knowing that pain isn't going to be a competition, and that other people somehow suffered more, doesn't make my life better. It didn't make my life better knowing that I was dealing with alcoholism on a daily basis. It gives us context. It shows us what humans are capable of enduring, how people move forward, even without certainty, how we can be resilient without, I don't know, I guess just that we can be resilient and strong, and we can do the next right thing. We just have to figure out, and they did, my 16-year-old grandfather figured out what the next right thing was, and they were able to do it. So it's something that grounds you deeply about that. And when I learned, like I said, more about my grandparents, and even my grandparents on the other side, Irish pig farmers living in Ohio, near where that train went off the rails and poisoned all the water. Poor. They were poor. They didn't have a dime to their name. And even though they had been in the United States a pretty long time, they never had a dime to their name, my dad's parents. And they made sure that their kids got educated, but they didn't have choices. They didn't have enough food. My dad insisted that a lot of his eye issues had to do with the lack of nutrition the entire growing up. He went into the military, and he ended up getting a scholarship to a very good school because he was particularly brilliant at math. But they, on that side, had to live with few choices about their lives, no safety, no comfort, and no information. They did the best they could. We are living in a time where we can optimize our lives. We can wait till conditions are ideal. We can have backup plans for every decision we can gain. the entire world sitting there, on the internet, and they were making choices without information, without guarantees. And my grandparents on both sides of my family continued. They kept, plugging along and did the best they could. And, it ultimately led to me. And so, like I said, it's the fact that they acted while they were struggling, which was the most important part. That's what made the difference. And that's what it led to me, is it didn't matter that my grandfather was scared and didn't know what to do with his two younger sisters and how he was going to make it in the United States. He kept moving. And my grandmother, who comes to this country, doesn't know a stitch of the language. She's 8 years old. I think what she had told me is that they got here and had nothing. I mean, it was just the ultimate dirt poor. They didn't even have family here or anything like that. And like I said, on my dad's side, they were poor pig farmers and did the best that they could. And so if we get this wisdom, in my sense, I got it, like I said, when I was young from my grandparents. But there's other places you can do. What if you don't know your grandparents, or your grandparents, now are living here generation after generation? Maybe they didn't have that kind of complicated, painful life that my grandparents had, but not everyone does, so that's the idea. And so how do you get that kind of wisdom if it's not locked up in your family the way it had been in mine? You can talk to people who lived through something hard. There's people all around us who have lived through something. It could be other relatives. It could be church members, neighbors, people in your community. You can volunteer. You don't need to interrogate them. Just talk to them like human beings. Hear their stories. Ask them simple questions. What was the hardest seasons of your life? What helped you to keep going? What did you do when you didn't know what to do? And what do you wish you knew then that you know now? And so most people don't want pity for those things, but they do like to share the meaning of their story with other people, and listen to that and honor that. It will help you in so many ways. There are people around you, I can tell you, who did it. I gave the story of before when my friend's mother, she worked in a home for elderly people, and she left me in the lobby while she went and talked to her mom about some kind of, something that she had to talk to her mom about. And this woman came up to me and she started crying and saying, I think my daughter doesn't love me anymore. And I said, well, why do you think that? And I just had this 10-minute conversation with this woman. We prayed together. I held her hand and she told me about this story. There are people around you that can tell you an incredible story that will teach you something, about life and help you, with directions in your own life. The other thing too is you can volunteer in places where life is not easy. That might be in a place like I was in the lobby, could be food pantries and shelters, hospitals, senior centers, veterans administrations, and community outreach programs. So there's a lot of places that you can go. And again, we're not there to interrogate them. We're there to have conversations and just to listen to people. Sometimes that's the best thing that you can do with other people. When you go there, you will learn about other people, but you also learn how people endure and how people move on when they don't know what to do. And you'll start to notice that people have creativity under pressure and gratitude when there's no way to see through something to be grateful for, and strength that they didn't even know they had themselves until they had it. So that's the idea. And the last type of place that you can do is you can also read books. And in most cases, I read productivity books or like, the 10 steps to fix whatever. But instead, biographies, memoirs, first-person accounts are all over the internet. And not just extraordinary people. Like there's that fellow who was in the Japanese war camp. I think his book was Unbroken. Incredible book. But, there's an ordinary book or ordinary people who survived through amazing things. And so when you can't find someone in real life to get together with, potentially reading a book about them, and you'll find out that life didn't always resolve neatly for them, that their faith was tested, that people kept going, that they kept going anyway. And these hard lives are recorded all over the place, and their honesty can be incredibly grounding. There's a lot of podcasts and YouTube channels with interviews with people too. And it's it's better, I think. And so I'll say it this way. I think it's better when you get to talk to someone who can ask real people real questions and talk about their experiences they have in my life. For me, it was digging a little bit into the history, finding, context, listening to my parents and my grandparents talk about those experiences that they had. At one point at the summer, like I said, my grandfather came from Kiev, had his cousins visit them, and they were actually well-to-do people now in the Soviet Union. They were musicians who were on tour in the United States. And they spent the summer with me and my mom at my grandmother's house. And all summer long, I got to ask them about life in the Soviet Union. They kept their children hostage while they were traveling in the United States, like, you better come back. We got your kids. And it was amazing and remarkable just to go to the grocery store with them. I remember the first time they walked into the grocery store near my grandmother's house, which wasn't a particularly large grocery store. The woman from the Soviet Union wept. She wept like I've never seen anyone weep like that. She had never seen so much food in her entire life. And so it helped me understand the real things that were going on in the Soviet Union at that time. I got a summer education about what was really going on. Two very wealthy people, so they were doing better than most of the people in the Soviet Union, and how horrible it was. And so it allowed me to look at their daily lives, to see the choices that they made, to actually find out what survival required of them. It was a lot of understanding for me. Eventually, my grandfather died, and my grandmother took on another Russian woman to be her roommate. And she had to leave the Soviet Union in the middle of the night. She was a computer person, and leaving her children behind. And she did not get to see her children again until 1986. And I got another chance to listen to what life was like when you have to make impossible choices. So what do you do with this? I mean, in the end, when you get these kinds of lessons that were going on, it's about knowing how people get through hard lives, about how to live when the decisions are impossible and every decision feels like life or death. And we move forward when we don't have clarity. They moved forward when they didn't know what was going to happen for them. They had no reassurances, but they had to act. And it shows us how we, when we face these times, these hard times, we can start doing the next small step again and again. The next small step, the next small thing we should do again and again. It helps us to be survivors. It helps us to know that there are ways of making decisions that aren't perfect, but that they move us forward in the right direction. And it helps us not remove our own pain or whatever it is we're going through. Like I said, this isn't a pain competition, but we know that we can have compassion and mercy and responsibility and trust in God and faithfulness to other people and doing one small step. So I guess I just wanted to encourage you, go find someone, read a memoir, volunteer someplace where people had hard lives, and understand, the world around you, but also understand what makes tough people act. It'll help you in so many ways I can't even express it. So I hope that helps you. If you have anything to say to me, you can email me at jill@startwithsmallsteps.com. Put a comment right here. I just believe that, as we start, as grandparents start to be removed from our lives, we still can have opportunities to ask them questions about their lives, to ask them questions about how they got there. And if they're not here, or they didn't have those kinds of lives, there's plenty of other people we can talk to.
To give you a
Appreciate
little
you being out
idea
there
about what it is other
Thanks so
generations
much, and have a
went through.
wonderful day. Like I said, not because it's a competition or not because it eases your pain or anything that you're feeling or doing right now at all, but just to let you know, just to kind of give you a picture, because I think that we don't talk about history in the same ways that we did. So if you have people that were born in the silent generation, that was 1928 to 1945, that generation grew up in the shadow of World War II. So the World War I was somewhere like 1915. You had the Great Depression. You had the Roaring '20s. And now we are coming out of the Roaring '20s. And so they had memories of the Great Depression and World War II. There was childhood hunger, rationing. Parents were traumatized by war, went to war. There was a lot of children acting as adults because the parents were the dad was off at war, the mom was working to put food on the table. And it was a culture where people were not discussing emotions. And so you just had to endure. And so they learned you don't complain, you don't waste anything, and you don't expect life to be fair. And so maybe sometimes people I have known tended to be a little bit cold, but that was because that they survived something and they had to be restrained about it. It was survival in that particular case. Their silence was a survival technique. Then you had the greatest generation, which overlaps a little bit differently, but they fought in World War II, lived through it directly. They saw friends die young because of war, and they returned home, built families, cities, economies. And so some of them had physical disabilities and injuries, psychological trauma from going to such a brutal and awful war. But they also had a deep sense of duty to family and nation and God. And they never asked themselves questions about fulfillment. They asked themselves about, is this necessary? Is this a duty I must perform? The baby boomer generation, which is roughly 1946 to 1964, people think of them as having it easy. Oh, they just had everything they want. They grew up and they didn't have to go through what I went through. But you know what? They had nuclear war anxiety. Kids practiced what they would do in drills in case a nuke came. The Cold War was scary as anything else. Missiles were put in Cuba. We had the Vietnam War. There were assassinations of major leaders, and the culture was in complete upheaval. That dismantled a lot of things that were considered to be certainties that were no longer certainties. And they saw institutions fail the people. They watched moral consensus fracture, and they were told to build a new world without a map. There was nothing there. What they grew up with was instability all the time in almost every reach of society. Gen X, that's where I'm at. We are called the forgotten generation. It's kind of funny because it's actually quite true. Because you watch in TV shows, we went from baby boomers being the main function of shows directly, to younger people. And I thought, what happened to us? But we had high divorce rates. That's where latchkey kids were called, where suddenly we were home without anyone at home. It was the first time that you would walk through a neighborhood and you knew that you could run to any house and get help if you needed to. And now in that generation, there was no help to be found. Parents weren't home during the day. We learned independence as early, and it wasn't by our choice. And what we learned was you can't rely on systems. You take care of yourself, expect disappointment. And it taught us to be resilient, for sure. And then there was a lot of disillusionment as well. We had our own strifes and our own things that were going on and our own fears. I grew up on a military base that was considered to be a first strike zone in the case of nuclear war with Russia. We were the most northern military base in the United States, and if there was an attack, we would be hit first. So it was a scary thing for me, and I'd lived with the thought that we were going to obliterate ourselves at any given moment. Millennials that are born from 1981 to 1996, they had 9/11. They had endless war coverage when they were very young. I kind of thought, gosh, what is this doing to people? We had that Great Recession that everyone was talking about, crushing student debt and a shifting job market with fewer guarantees in a world that it was also changing very rapidly. What I find kind of funny about the situation is back in, I watched the show Mad Men. And Mad Men takes place, I don't know, maybe 15 years, before I was cognizant of the world. And I remember that world. Not much changed in the world of Mad Men to the time when I was a teenager, but now the world changes so drastically fast. And that's what people, are growing up with now. They were told, I think, to follow your dreams, and then they discovered that dreams don't pay the rent. And stability was no longer a promised thing. So it got a lot of anxiety. Gen Z, born 1990 to 2010, constant connectivity. I can't even imagine what it would be like to have one of these in schools. When I went home from school, I didn't have to deal with all the people in the school. I was hanging out with my family. I was hanging out with my friends. I was doing my own thing. I don't know what they were doing, and I don't know what they were talking about. But today, constant connectivity, social comparison on this global scale, the pandemic, it did all these things, anxiety about the political and cultural polarization in the United States, but also the world, and nothing feels settled. And they don't remember a time before there was so much noise in this world. So there's a thread that runs basically through every generation. And that, when we slam each other, we talk about it, there's always this feeling that every generation believed that the world was falling apart, that there was no certainty in the future, and life was harder than it should be. Every generation felt that way, and every generation, to an extent, was partly right. So what changes is what shapes us. What shapes us makes us who we are and can make us into stronger individuals. But that's the idea, is that we're not uniquely burdened. We're not helpless. And people survived all these situations without options, without information, without guarantees. And we're able to do that. Humans get stronger when we adapt, when we become stronger. I was thinking about this as an analogy that I lift weights, right? And what happens when you lift weights is you lift something that's heavier than what you can deal with. Your muscles tear a little bit, and then they come back stronger. It's an analogy to all of life. When we tear a little bit, we come back stronger, more resilient, bigger, able to handle more things than we were able to handle before if we let it. If we let up on that idea that our time is worse than anyone else's time, and instead we gain this humility, this strength, we tap into this wisdom of all of humankind, and we don't live to validate our own pain. Instead, it just reminds us the history of humanity is about endurance, and it has a long history. We're standing inside of it. So I appreciate you being there and listening to all of this. Like I said, it's just something that kind of struck me when I was doing some investigation about my own grandparents' life. I appreciate you being out there. If you have anything to say to me, you can go to jillfromthenorthwoods.com. It has all the ways you can contact me, or you can say something right here. Appreciate you being out there and striving in humanity along with me. Thanks so much, and have a great day.